Welcome to the Build Wealth Canada podcast, where it's all about becoming debt-free, accelerating your wealth, and taking control of your money. Now, here's your host, Cornell Schreiber.
Hey, it's Cornell, and welcome to the Build Wealth Canada show. We talk a lot about growing our net worth as Canadians here on the show, but what about actually protecting our assets from threats like fraud? So I thought we'd get some security experts on the show to teach us some best practices when it comes to protecting ourselves and our family, especially when it comes to our finances here in Canada. To help me with this, I have two security experts on the show today who are part of the security teams at the largest bank in Canada. They have entire teams devoted to security. They invest a lot of time and money to ensure that they and their clients are following the best practices. So today, you and I are going to learn on what we can do as regular Canadians to best protect ourselves. So let's get into it with our first guest, Kevin Purkiss, who is the Vice President of Fraud Management at RBC. He leads the team responsible for managing RBC's fraud capabilities, and he helps protect the many thousands of Canadians that they serve. And now let's jump in to learn what you and I should be doing to better protect ourselves. All right, Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. I'm really pleased to be here.
Awesome. Kevin, to kick things off, is fraud something that should especially be on our radar, particularly with the invention of AI tools that are now being utilized for fraud?
You know, I'm so glad you're talking to us about fraud. It absolutely should be on everybody's radar. It has been growing in Canada. We saw from the Canadian Anti-Fraud Center, they had 62,000 reported frauds in 2023 and over $554 million in losses. And what I can assure you is this is just a drop in the bucket, because I know it's underreported. Only between 10 and 20% even report when they're a victim of fraud. So probably everybody listening in today knows somebody or maybe has been a victim of fraud. And even when we've talked to Canadians, 75% of respondents, when we did a recent poll, said they're more concerned about fraud than ever before. And really, with the adoption of online banking, e-commerce, what we're seeing through the industry is an extraordinary high level of credit card and e-payment fraud with all kinds of compromised credentials, clients falling victims to scams, and it's just getting bigger and bigger. When you talk about AI, that adds a whole new dimension for things, because there's a lot of buzz about AI, justifiably. There's a lot of potential really there to revolutionize the processes and how we all interact. But as good as that may be, it really has given a whole new tool set to the fraudsters. And the fraudsters are really using it now to up their game and steal from Canadians. We've seen that when we did a survey, 9 in 10 Canadians said the use of AI will increase scam attempts over the next year and could make everyone more vulnerable to fraud. When you look at that kind of stats, clearly Canadians are seeing it too. And really, the biggest concern seems to be around voice cloning and impersonation scams. AI tools in themselves are really making it hard to tell when you get an email, text, any kind of phishing, is it the real thing? It's fooling Canadians into thinking they're dealing with the genuine company because the quality is just so good. And really looking forward, we can expect more challenges to come from this with cloning, deep fakes, and fraudsters trying to continually get more sophisticated in their efforts.
When you mentioned cloning, is that when basically they make it sound like somebody that you know, for example, and then make that sound genuine through the use of AI? And then so you think you're maybe telling it to somebody that you actually know when really it's a fraudster? Is that what that is?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So what happens is they'll take a snippet of conversation and use that to then extrapolate your voice to all kinds of dialogue. And even a small amount of voice sample, a few seconds long, can be used to do this. So it could be used, for example, in the classic grandparent scam, where they'll call and say, your grandchild's been in an accident or in some legal trouble, you need to send some money. They could even emulate that grandchild's voice now to try and convince you that this is a genuine event happening. That's just one example, and there's others absolutely that are out there.
Yeah, and that would be relatively easy to do, I would think, because thinking of a grandchild, maybe they're probably on YouTube or some social media site, maybe they have a video they recorded. So very easy to get their voice that way. And then the fraudsters can use these AI tools to then say what you want that person to say in that voice. And then now they call the grandparent. So if they can make that connection between the grandparent and the kid, for example, or teenager or whatever, yeah, I could see that not being very difficult to do for sure.
That's right. You really got to watch and make sure where is your genuine voice appearing, and whether it's through social media or those other methodologies, even voicemail. It's amazing where you could pick up these samples from, and so much can be done with it.
Yeah. And it's not with the cloning technology, it's not like it's some hidden thing available to highest levels of government or military. This is something that's available at the consumer level. I know with the editing program that my podcast editor uses, that tool, it's a regular program. Anybody can go and buy it, and you can actually simulate your own voice, which can be helpful for doing edits and things like that. But in the wrong hands, it's so easy to use that and make things sound just from a sample of someone else's voice.
You're bang on. And I think people maybe haven't realized how easy it is to get into the activity of fraud. And we're even seeing situations beyond voice where you can go onto dark web and buy phishing campaigns, almost call it fraud as a service, where there's things available now where you can go and get a subscription for this, set up phishing campaigns, and then they look like the genuine article. You can choose the bank, you can choose the methodology that you're going to deploy, and go get some credentials, and then use those credentials to try and commit fraud. It's just another example of how AI has really made some of those interfaces look so genuine. If you're coming from another country, you don't need to have a local translator. You can use AI to have very clear language and make sure that the dialogue that you're reading, whether it's on the site, whether it's through an email, it really reads like the genuine article.
And it sounds like this is not something where, there's going to be a solution that solves it and then we can move on. We don't have to worry about it as much. Because now when I see the developments that we're seeing even in AI and the video generation, just now can make it look so genuine now, where you actually see, let's say, your grandchild, a video of them, and that was actually generated by AI by taking samples of something else. So, I mean, it's something that I think we're going to have on our radars for a long time.
I think it really does pay, unfortunately, to be a bit cynical when it comes to evaluating what you're seeing come through and get into the old fashioned of, does this seem like reality? In that example that you've portrayed, really your best defense is to make sure you're contacting your relatives yourself and talk to either the parents of the child or the child and make sure that what is happening is real, because odds are that it absolutely isn't. And you are just somebody is trying to attempt a scam. So that vigilance and a healthy skepticism, making sure that you're not responding too quickly to things is absolutely important, because a technique that the fraudster will 100% use is try to create a sense of urgency in terms of getting you to respond quickly, getting you kind of off your game with putting some emotion into the situation. So maybe you don't think quite as clearly. And those are the first two ingredients that often lead to that path of the scam.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One technique that's kind of always made me feel a bit more secure is that if someone calls me and they look like they might be legitimate, but I'm having some doubts, is just for me to call that company instead, because I'm in their database. So it technically shouldn't matter which customer service rep I speak to. Like we all, I'm sure you've had these CRA calls, the fake CRA calls as well, right? If I'm not sure, I should just hang up and call CRA directly, because they would have me in the system and then they can verify whether what that person's claiming is true or not. Is that a technique that you think can work quite well? Are there any other ones that you like to use?
Yeah, you're right on the money on that one. I think that it's great advice that you're giving out. When one of the big challenges we've seen is bank impersonation scams. So that's where fraudsters are pretending to be your bank, and they'll reach out to you and they'll say that there's been a fraud on your account or something on your account and ask you to participate with them in diagnosing what's going on. And they'll convince you to disclose your credentials. They'll convince you to send money, a number of things that as your bank, we would never ask anybody to do. But the fraudster creates a very compelling scenario and they convince people this is the case. And absolutely, rather than take that call, if you have any uncertainty whatsoever, the phone numbers to call will be on your credit card. It'll be on your debit card. Just look at those cards, call that number, hang up whoever you're talking to, call that number back. If it was us as your bank calling you, we'll have all that on file. And when you call us back, then we will be able to verify indeed whether that was genuine or not. And if so, we'll help you out.
Mm-hmm. And I like how you mentioned how they will try to use the urgency and something scary, something negative, because that could make the person think, okay, I better resolve this immediately, as opposed to taking that extra step, hanging up, calling back, that kind of a thing. So it sounds like if you get a call like this or an email and there is that urgency being used, that's sort of a red flag to think, okay, this might actually be fraud, and just another thing in your checkbox where maybe you should verify it even more so. Yeah.
It's great. So typical in so many scams that they'll create that sense of urgency, whether it's somebody emulating calling from the police or legal counsel or your bank or whomever it might be. They'll create that sense of urgency because it keeps you from doing what might be most rational, which is investigating it yourself. So if you can slow things down, if you can pause and think about what's happening and not respond, don't feel like the Canadian that you have to be so polite. Just be a little bit cynical and pause, think about what's going on, be willing to hang up on the individual and call back on your own. It really can be the difference between being a victim of a scam or not.
And now when it comes to protecting our finances and other information from fraud, there are a handful of ways to protect ourselves, such as using a PIN, biometrics, text or email verification. Are some methods more effective than others when it comes to protecting ourselves and our family? And what would you say are the most secure methods that we should be using?
It's a great question. And I think my advice would first and foremost, if you are using a mobile phone, please use the mobile apps from your financial institution. They're a very secure way to transact with your bank. Your phone is clearly identifiable to you. It has biometric, whether it's your face, whether it's your thumbprint. Those things are invaluable. And it really often will create up even more ability for you to do bigger things because it's a more secure way to transact. The other thing that I would encourage absolutely everybody to do is to make sure you've set up multi-factor authentication for your bank or other critical accounts. It can make a huge difference. And that's where it's going to send an alert every single time. It's going to send an alert to your phone that you have to verify that this is who it is. That is what we call authentication. And authentication is so critical to interacting securely. I would advise that even if you are, whether it's bank or your Amazon account, maybe you've given other people access to buy and sell things within your Amazon account, you can set up alerts so it'll notify you if someone's making those purchases. So multi-factor authentication across any of your critical services, I think is an absolutely fabulous idea. And then the last thing I would suggest as it pertains to banking, you can go into those apps and set up alerts yourself. You know how you interact with your bank. You know what you would typically put in a payment or what bills you pay. You can put up alerts in those apps that will notify you if something outside the normal happens. So we're looking for those things, but you can look for those things on your own based on what your patterns are. I, for example, will set up alerts on my mother's account because I know that what her patterns are going to be. We have a joint account together, and I know that if I see something come through that's a little bit unusual, it'll send me a signal. It'll give me something to investigate so I can have that peace of mind.
That's such a great tip. I'm thinking both for elderly parents, but even I'm a parent to two young kids, even something like that, once they get older, maybe they're not as knowledgeable about all these different ways that they could be taken advantage of. I could see that being a very good way to have that joint account, set up alerts so you both get it, that kind of a thing. It's really smart.
Absolutely. I'm in the same situation with older parents and younger kids. And absolutely, I set up alerts on each of those circumstances, set limit thresholds on what they can actually do, because you can sometimes clamp those down as well. So there's ways that you can absolutely protect yourself.
Mm-hmm. Sounds great. Now, are there any channels or tools that may appear safe, but are not in reality?
I think what we have to watch is where the fraudsters are lurking in those things which we're familiar with. And I think one of the most important pieces of advice is it's important to know who you are dealing with, regardless of where you interact. When you're sending money and moving that money around, do you really know who it is that you're sending it to? And are you confident in that? For example, if you buy something on Facebook, you may be interacting with somebody that you've never met before. How do you know that profile is genuine? So I think doing a level of diligence to be confident about that interaction is important. I think if you look at websites, it's real easy to have an emulated website. How do you know that website is legitimate that you're dealing with? And that's a real retailer that you're used to dealing with. You got to really watch for the ones that are maybe offshore, where something popped up through a Google search and you just clicked on that. The fraudsters can buy those priority positions in Google searches as well. So just because they show up on the top of the list doesn't mean they're a legitimate vendor. So you really have to be cautious as you're doing your normal routines of interacting with people that you're going to send money to, or that they're giving you money, that you actually know who it is you're dealing with and you feel confident that person or that organization that you're dealing with online is indeed legitimate.
Yeah, that's such a great tip. I remember it used to be many years ago where if you want a website, you have to know how to code, you have to know HTML, that whole thing. Now anyone can just go and make one. It's really evolved where anybody can get one very quickly. And so that's no longer as big of a signal of legitimacy as it used to be that, there's a website, so clearly this is some sort of legitimate company, because they could just create another one, but probably within 10 minutes if they wanted to, especially if they're sophisticated enough. fraudulent organization.
We also see it with things like investment opportunities where it'll look very legitimate, whether it's Bitcoin is a popular one where there's a lot of fraud happening in that space. And certainly it'll look like a legitimate organization when in fact it's a fraudster in behind it. I think the other ones that you could run into to look at is use the old adage, if it's too good to be true, then it probably is. So, did you really win the $1,000? Are you really going to have, if you play that game, is it going to give you money? Genuinely, what are you giving away in order to get those benefits? Are they making you put in your email and some passwords or credentials? There's lots of things to really be cautious about as you're interacting in that space.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And now, if we are suspicious that a message we received might be fraudulent in some way, is there an easy and fast way to check its authenticity?
One of the things that I would suggest is if you get a text in Canada, you can forward that text that you suspect to 7726. That's a number that is set up by the telecoms to report phishing, and they will go through and it'll help them take down the people that are doing these activities. So that's an important thing to do. I think the other thing is, did you actually initiate anything? If you have not contacted that organization and you're getting it out of the blue, my first response to that would be to be skeptical that it's really something. And when you see a phishing campaign, whether it's an email or a text coming through to you, it won't be tuned to you. You could get something that is from your bank, but that's just coincident. You likely will have seen it come from all of the banks at some point where they say there's something unusual in your account. If that happens, don't action that. Don't click on the link that comes with the text. If there's a link in that text, it absolutely is a fraud. So they're just trying to get your credentials so they can get into your accounts and then commit fraud. So the absolute clearest thing to look for is look for links in your emails and texts. And I will assure you, if there are links, absolutely do not do that. The other ones they could do is they would give you phone numbers to respond to. Don't call that number. Pick up your card, look at what it says on your credit card or your debit card and phone that phone number.
That's great. And now when it comes to using public Wi-Fi networks, are we better off not using them at all when possible, just due to the risk of maybe getting hacked? Or should we not use them only when doing sensitive tasks like banking, for example?
Yeah, I think certainly my own habits would be to use my cell data whenever possible. I think that's the most secure if you're traveling. And now with the data plan rates coming down so much, that probably isn't the inhibition that it used to be maybe even a year ago. So I really would stay away from using public Wi-Fi networks. You just don't know if someone's put something on there that could infiltrate your PC or device that could cause you problems down the road. So certainly for financial transactions, banking, anything like that, I absolutely will, even at the airport, honestly, I will not use that kind of Wi-Fi for those sensitive transactions.
Yeah, data seems to have really come down. And I guess even if you're in another country, you're traveling to the US, let's say, you're saying it's better off to pay that extra, whatever it is, to get that data plan, just to have that peace of mind, extra security, instead of just trying to go to the nearest McDonald's or whatever, going into that network and hoping everything works out.
Yeah, I've got to the place where I never use public Wi-Fi anymore. Mm-hmm. It's just not worth it.
Mm-hmm. That's good to know. Yeah, I always wondered, because I'm not a programmer guy myself. And so is it possible for someone to actually hack in, even though you're not really, just from using the network by itself? But you're saying it's basically not a risk worth taking, essentially, especially how accessible data plans are these days as well.
Yes, that's how I treat it for sure.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And can you tell us where we can learn more and receive any additional free resources on how we can better protect ourselves? I know you guys do a lot of work in this area, trying to protect consumers. And as the largest bank in Canada, you obviously have a lot invested in making sure that things are secure on your end as well. So maybe can you give us some advice where we can go to learn more?
Sure. There's a couple of things that you can absolutely do. If you're doing the research yourself, you can go online to our website, and I can give you the link after this. You can attach it to the podcast. Sure. But its references how to protect yourself online from RBC. So if you do a search on that, you'll find us. And we got lots of tips on there really around what to expect, what kind of scams we're seeing in the marketplace, what's current, how to keep yourself safe online, the general maintenance activities you can do, how to make sure you're as safe and secure as possible. So I think that's an absolutely fabulous resource for people to seek out. You'll also find the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre publishes a little black book of frauds. And they keep current for Canadians with respect to what is being seen in the marketplace overall. So certainly the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre, I think, is a great resource. Any of your own financial institutions that folks may be dealing with, I'm sure will have a very strong presence online to educate you. We also put things in our app. If you go into the mobile app for RBC, we have cyber tips within the app itself now that will educate and inform you about the risks and how to protect yourself. So any number of sources. And if you like to talk to us, you can go into your branches when you're there next. And certainly our folks are very familiar with what's happening in the world of fraud, and they can give you advice and counsel as well.
That's great. And I did want to call out one particular page that I had someone from your team send me. And maybe it's the one that you were referring to in the beginning, the how to protect yourself online, where it's almost like a tool where you have on the top the different types of, or I guess categories of where fraud can take place. And then you click on the one that's most relevant to your situation. And then it'll basically jump and give you some good tips there. That was a really good one. Read through it myself. And definitely there were quite a few things in there that I learned as well. Certain best practices that you can employ depending on what you're doing. So there were some ones for like social media versus, just different kind of categories of life where fraud can take place. So definitely I'll link to that as well. And actually for everybody listening, I actually created a link that you can go to where it's easy to remember and type. It's just buildwealthcanada.ca/security. And you can go there. You don't have to enter your email or anything like that. It's all free. And you can go there and you can learn some of the best practices. Like I said, I've learned quite a bit by looking through it myself. And I think it's a good best practice for you to use and send to your friends and family, since, we all have to protect ourselves. So that's buildwealthcanada.ca/security. So I want to say, Kevin, great job to you and your team for putting that together. And I appreciate you guys helping out Canadians in that regard, especially as things continue to evolve, especially with AI. It used to be so obvious to know the fraud, and now sometimes it still is, but some of them are getting pretty sophisticated. And so I feel like it's something we do have to have on our radar on an ongoing basis, and we'll have to have it for the foreseeable future as well, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately, but I really do appreciate you taking the time to get into this important topic. I think the secret to this is really education and awareness. And the more that people take time to educate and learn about it, the safer they're going to be.
For sure. Thanks so much for the practical tips and the resources as well. And until next time, thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
All right, take care. Bye. All right, now let's dive into our interview with Kevin's colleague, Vice President Shekhar Puri, who is going to take us through some additional best practices that you and I should be using to enhance our security, especially when it comes to our finances. All right, Shekhar, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Cornell.
Shekhar, in the realm of digital security, two-step and multi-factor authentication are often mentioned. Could you demystify these terms for us and shed some light on their significance for digital banking users?
Yeah, absolutely, Cornell. And it is a question we get often from our clients as well. But what I'll do is I'll maybe take a bit of a step back and actually even throw in the word identification, because even identification and authentication are intermingled at times as well. And maybe, Cornell, what I'll do is I'll start with an example. And one of the examples clients or your listeners may be very familiar with is as you're boarding a plane. So as you're boarding a plane, one of the things you do right away, you're asked for by the agent is, can I see your boarding pass? And that in a way is what we call identification. So you're identifying yourself as, hey, I'm Shekhar Puri and here's my boarding pass. And then what the agent does is it says, hey, can we also see your passport or your driver's license if it's a domestic flight? And that is a form of authentication. So they're basically doing a two-step to one, identify who you are vis-a-vis your boarding pass, and then two, authenticating you as it pertains to, can I see your passport? Similarly, in the digital world, identification is usually when a client enters in their username, it could be their email address. And then what happens is they're asked to authenticate themselves. And that generally is enter your password. Now, where we get into the realm of two-step and multi-factor authentication is basically leveraging some strengthened security that many organizations use to say, okay, thanks for your password, but what we're going to do is use a form of two-step or multi-factor authentication. Now, when you're looking at authentication, Cornell, what happens is generally there's three categories of authentication. Something you know, like your password, or can you tell us your mom's maiden name, which everyone heard, or your school best friend, favorite hockey team, go Leafs. So that's something you know. And then there's also something you may have, and that could be your phone or some sort of a token, which could be in the form of a thumb drive or some sort of a token that automatically generates these numbers that you have to enter. And then finally, something that you are, which could be a fingerprint or a face scan. So those are the three categories of authentication. So when we talk about two-step verification basically draws on one of those particular categories in addition to your password. Multi-factor authentication, this is a slight nuance the layman or the average user wouldn't pick this up. Multi-factor authentication does the same thing, but when it draws on a different authentication, it has to use a different category. So if you enter your password, that's something you know. Multi-factor authentication will then challenge you with either something you have or something that you are. So that's the slight difference between two-step and multi-factor authentication. Then there's a little bit of and I'll try not to make it overly complicated. There's a little bit of a term called two-step authentication. Two-step authentication is simply a subset of multi-factor authentication. Two-step authentication means we'll use two authenticators. Multi-factor is two or more authenticators. So that's generally how it works.
Mm-hmm. And so practically speaking, if we're trying to make sure, let's say, our brokerage account secure, banking secure, we should be looking for enrolling, I guess you could say, into these multi-factor authentications when possible, because it's so much harder to replicate all three for someone that's trying to, let's say, hack into our accounts, things of that nature, as opposed to you have a password and then you know the mother's maiden name, but that could all be in like a notepad somewhere. And so if someone gets a hold of that, you're in trouble. And so I'm guessing this just makes it exponentially harder for someone to hack in because now they need those three different sources. Did I understand that correctly?
Spot on, Cornell.
Awesome.
If you are, an end user and interacting with a particular organization or a service provider, and they offer multi-factor authentication, I strongly recommend that you enroll in that because, to your point, passwords can get compromised. And by enrolling in multi-factor authentication and leveraging it, it significantly reduces the risk of unauthorized access in case your password is compromised, and completely strongly mitigates any sense of fraud occurring as well, and really protecting your assets.
Mm. Yeah, I like the analogy used with the airplane, because even if they're able to duplicate or get a fraudulent copy of your boarding pass, it's way harder to also get a copy of your passport, or they have your passport, but then they don't have your board. This is the same kind of thought process, it sounds like. That's fantastic. Yeah, we hear these terms all the time, but which one's better? What's the difference? What's the nuance? But the way now that you've explained it, I can see how it just becomes exponentially harder someone to hack in when you require a three or two, particularly if they're from the different sources. Very, very interesting. Now, moving on from that, one of the things you mentioned is passwords and the task of managing and regularly updating our passwords for various apps and websites. That can be daunting for many. We use so many of them now, and each one's supposed to be unique and hard to remember and all that kind of stuff. Can you share some insights on why this seemingly tedious process is crucial for our digital safety? And maybe as well, you can tell me, what do you like to use? Are there any sort of best practices to help us manage all of this so that we're not, my wife's going to kill me for saying this, but I think my wife just resets her password every time because she can't remember. So what are some good ways to get around this task where we're employing these best practices, but it's still practical and not this major time-consuming thing for us as well?
We'll start with a little bit of levity, even though it is pretty serious. That I was recently looking at the study that was done, and researchers had investigated the most common password that was stolen. Cornell, you're going to hate hearing this, but the most common password that was stolen was 123456, followed by the word admin, followed by 12345678, and followed by the word password. So you could see that, look, end users do find this a tedious task. And it reflects on the fact that these are the most commonly used passwords. No one likes passwords. However, password hygiene is absolutely critical. And it is something that RBC constantly educates and reminds our clients to do. Yes, it is a bit of a daunting task as well, but it is a fundamental cornerstone of maintaining digital safety. And I'll just provide some advice here, that you should use a unique password for each one of the services that you're using, whether it's your email accounts, whether it's your LinkedIn, whether it's other social media, whether it's your banking. The risk is if you're reusing your passwords, obviously, if one of them gets hacked or compromised, then that could be the master key that kind of unlocks all of your services as well. So I think number one, making sure that you're using unique passwords for each of your services. Number two, exactly what your wife does. You do want to regularly update your passwords. Complexity, you're noticing a lot of organizations now not simply accepting 123456 or password. They're asking for special characters or a mix of caps and lowercase as well. So that, I think, is something, Cornell, is one of the key messages, if we can get out to your listeners, is to make sure that they're updating their passwords they have complexity built into their passwords, and they're not reusing the same password for multiple sites, it is definitely a very strong deterrent from fraud.
Mm-hmm. That sounds good. And then as we explore the future of digital security and banking, are there any innovative solutions or technologies on the horizon that could potentially replace traditional passwords or just make things a little bit easier for the end user?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's one of the things, Cornell, that we have numerous teams across the bank that are constantly exploring new innovative solutions to not only enhance digital security, but to also balance that out with user experience as well, because we know passwords, again, is a tedious task, but it is also something that could be a threat vector. So, until we get to a proven and hardened technology that could truly replace passwords, the one thing I would say is to have, again, your listeners leverage biometric authentication wherever they can, right? So if they're using mobile devices, leverage that, leverage the fingerprint scanning, leverage the facial recognition as well. And then along with passwords, please, if you have the opportunity, turn on multi-factor authentication. Now, that being said, you did ask a specific question around what's kind of emerging in the industry. And there are solutions, Cornell, that seem to be very promising that are emerging in the industry that could potentially replace password and in fact combine the replacement of passwords and authentication all at the same time. One of the ones that seems to be interesting, and I'm not endorsing it quite yet, but we are doing some exploratory work on it, is passkeys, which has been something that leverages the FIDO2 standard as well. And a lot of your listeners may have already started to see it pop up in LinkedIn or Kayak, PayPal as well. I think some of the Gmail users are starting to see that too. It's a very interesting technology stack where they do leverage the device as a means for you to be able to access websites. So if you're passkey enabled, you don't have to even enter a password at all. What you're doing is you're leveraging your device to sign in and authenticate you at the same time. And there is no credential sharing between you and that particular application as well. So
interesting.
Very interesting area. And we're closely looking at it. And it does seem very promising. But like I said, there's a lot of different solutions that are starting to come out to really tackle this issue. And that's something that, look, we're acutely aware of. And we're always scanning the market for some of these best-in-class solutions.
Very interesting. Yeah, I've noticed that on my iPhone recently. I remember I saw it prompting me multiple times for the passkey, and I didn't see that on my previous phone. I was curious about how secure is this exactly? Is this kind of a good potential best practice now or in the future? So that's good to know, to keep an eye out for that one. So that one's basically using your device, and it's using, I'm guessing, the biometrics in your device, and it's looking at all these different things. And then if I understood you correctly, you're saying it's sort of like an intermediary. So if you're shopping online, all that information doesn't actually go to, let's say, the person's store. It's just held separately so that even if that store got compromised, your information is still safe. Is that sort of how it works?
There's no password for the bad actor to compromise. So even if a bad actor was to hack the servers, they're just getting a public key, which it's not very useful for them as well, right? So very interesting pattern. We could probably do a separate podcast on that one.
Just on that, yeah.
Well, just on that one.
I don't know. I'm a bit of a nerd, so to me, this is very interesting. Hopefully it is to listeners as well. But I remember just hearing in the news, you'd hear about these organizations that have gotten hacked that appeared very big organizations, very secure, and then they got compromised. And then, this information got leaked of their clients, things of that nature. And so this is really nice to see things evolve on the security side where you've got this passkey technology now where, okay, that giant company doesn't actually have all that information because they're using passkeys instead. So that's good to know because we've had so many of those, right, over the years. So it's nice to see that there's actually a solution. That's great. Now, the last time that I checked, RBC, you guys were actually the largest bank in Canada. I'm sure you probably still are, or definitely one of the biggest ones for sure. So of course, you guys, I'm sure, invested. But what you already kind of mentioned, you have entire teams of people working on this. So of course, you invest a lot in security to keep your clients' information safe and their money safe as well. Can you give us a glimpse into the types of technology that RBC uses to ensure the security of its clients? And then I suppose, like for myself and listeners of the show, this is good to know, but also if we see that you guys are doing it, then it's probably technology that we should be on the lookout as well, that if we're ever working with another financial institution, or like maybe our brokerages with someone else, let's say, then we should be on the lookout for these kind of technologies as well. Make sure that other companies are using these to keep us secure. Because you guys, I imagine, are probably at the gold standard when it comes to security, considering how big you are and the resources that you're devoting to security.
Yeah, no, Cornell, again, a great question here as well. So I won't dive too much into our trade secrets.
Yeah.
Because it is a differentiator. Look, the area of digital trust is critically important to any financial institution, not just RBC as well. You want, as your clients, to know that, look, when they're banking with you, when they're interacting with you, it's done in a very safe and secure way that respects the client's privacy as much as it does security as well. What I would do is simply put it this way. RBC takes really a three-pronged approach. Our first is what I call our perimeter detection capabilities as well. So this is where we work very closely with our cybersecurity teams. And really, the cybersecurity folks use a very sophisticated set of tools and tactical responses where they look at the perimeter and the traffic that is coming into our digital property. So before you even get in, it's all of the stuff that is coming towards us, looking at IPs, protecting against bot attacks, any other kinds of malicious requests. So we have a lot of different tools to not only detect, but to also take tactical actions around some of these particular traffic patterns as they're hitting our front door. The next layer I call the protection layers is actually our front door now. So this is where we do deploy items like multi-factor authentication or different identity and detection tools that as you're approaching the front door and you're trying to log into the digital container, we have those detections and authentication capabilities to ensure that Cornell is who he says he is, and he can be permitted to enter the digital property. And then finally, the third layer, Cornell, is a layer I call the fraud and business controls area. And this is where we do use some very advanced AI and machine learning once you're in the container to really detect against any kind of suspicious or unusual banking or transacting behavior. So again, we can take the appropriate action to ensure that the person that made it through the container is the person who they say they are based on some of the behaviors and the things that they're doing within the container. So again, we can take the appropriate action. Along with that, and I've already mentioned this, look, we have a very sophisticated monitoring system and controls put in place. We are constantly meeting with different people around emerging technologies, but we also have a dedicated group of fraud experts working 24/7. And Cornell, we're very proud about the role we play broadly in the industry. We talk to a lot of our industry peers. We work with various different standard bodies, with the government, with law enforcement. So we take a real concerted effort to protecting our clients as well. So it's not a simple answer. It's a multi-layered answer, but it's something we're very proud of what we do because, as I said, the area of digital trust is something that RBC strives to continue to be a leader in.
When you talked about using AI to detect certain suspicious patterns, is that like when you might get a notification saying that there's been a suspicious transaction on your account because let's say normally you spend this much at a store, but now it's triple that. And so that kind of raises a flag to say, okay, there's something out of the ordinary, and then it notifies you. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about there?
Yeah. That's a great prompt, Cornell. I mean, I'm assuming with your questions, you bank with us, so I'm going to keep my fingers crossed there. But absolutely, look, that is one of the tactical responses that we do, that if we do notice that there is a suspicious activity, again, we have various different things that we can do where we can actually stop a transaction from happening. Or what we can do is also provide an alert to our clients to say, and this is something that we deployed a couple of years ago. We call it our two-way fraud alerts technology, where we can alert a client to say, hey, we noticed this happen. Is this you? And a client can actually hit a button on their phone through a push notification and say, yeah, that's me. And we can let the transaction go through. Or a client can say, no, that's not me. And then again, we can take the appropriate responses as well. So again, a very cutting edge solution that we deployed, and we were one of the first FIs to deploy that. Now, along with that, Cornell, what we've also been a pioneer and a leader in is something that we call PIN on mobile. And that's a really neat pattern that we implemented. So think about this from a traditional perspective. A lot of times clients are used to, hey, when you're making a purchase, you swipe your card or you insert your card and you enter your PIN. Another pattern clients are used to is when they log in, username and password. Or sometimes clients are prompted with these personal verification questions or knowledge-based questions. Through our PIN and mobile release that we did about a year ago, we've combined all three of these patterns into a really neat pattern where if we need to authenticate you in the digital channel, we can actually ask you to either tap your card on your device and enter your PIN, or use biometric on your device and enter your PIN. So you're combining these neat patterns about something that you have, which is your device or your card, something that you know, which is your PIN, and something that you are, which is your facial recognition or the biometric to enter. So again, very innovative solution to protecting our clients, and with a pattern that really makes it challenging for fraudsters to try to break in as well. We've also, Cornell, leveraged and been one of the first FIs in North America to roll out something that we call ID verification. And that's the ability for clients to open up accounts, or prospects before they're RBC clients to open up accounts, and leveraging the ability for us to enable that account open end-to-end digitally. But the pattern that we use is have a client take a picture of their driver's license, and then we use a lot of AI and machine learning to validate that license is legit and hasn't been doctored or tampered with, and then take a selfie to match your face to that driver's license as well, to validate a client and authenticate that this is a real person and that this is a real ID. So again, security and authentication to help make banking easier for our clients. So those are a couple of really neat innovations that we've put in. And obviously we covered off the two-way fraud alerts thanks to your kind prompt.
Sounds good. Yeah, I think it's good to know these things, right? Just no matter which organization you're working with or that you use, whether it's in the banking sector or any other industry where, especially when money is exchanging hands, or even CRA, things of that nature, right? It's good to know these different methods, what they are, the pros and cons of some of them, some of the weaknesses, and ways to help secure things even more, like with the multi-factor authentication. I think that's a really good one. And I'm definitely going to be researching passkeys as soon as we get off here. You've definitely piqued my interest. So that's going to be a fun little project for myself. So that's great. Now, in the context of digital security, is there any additional advice or information you believe our listeners should be aware of to help enhance their protection online?
Look, I think we've covered off just the fact that if your financial institution leverages multi-factor authentication, look for it. It's key. And make sure you turn it on. Biometric on your device is also great. But the interesting thing, Cornell, that's going on right now is also the more and more sophisticated we get with our digital protections, fraudsters just move, right? Like they're shifty, right? They're constantly shifting. And they'll go into low-tech areas like scams and social engineering and phishing as well. So one of the very important thing for your listeners is obviously you want to turn on all of these digital protections. But the other thing that they want to be very cautious of is who are they sharing their personal financial information with online? Being very careful around how much information they share on social media sites, and also being aware that fraudsters do a lot of impersonations. They may call them and say, hey, this is law enforcement. Hey, this is an advisor from your financial institution. Hey, this is your relative. We have something going on here. We need this information from you right away. And to never, ever indulge personal financial information or their PIN or a one-time password that they may have received. You should never share that type of information online or over the phone. No financial institution will ever call you to ask you for your PIN. No financial institution will ever call you to ask you for your password or your one-time PIN that they might have sent out to you. So these kind of scams and social engineering are rampant. And that is something that I think your listeners need to be really careful about. Be careful about some of these dodgy websites as well. Being careful about some of these emails that are requesting information, just to be really vigilant around some of these suspicious forms of communication or links that they may be getting. And like I said, be very vigilant around who you share this information with. If you're not sure, err on the side of caution. Don't do it, and call your financial institution on the public numbers or the phone number behind your client card or your credit card. Call them and find out what's going on. And look, these are all great preventative measures. And everyone, like I said, has to be very vigilant.
Yeah, I was speaking with your colleague earlier about how easy it is now to create a voice track that basically sounds like somebody that you know, just through the use of these different tools that exist out there now, where you think you're listening to your grandmother or your father, your mother, someone that you know that you trust, but it could actually be something that was artificially generated by someone because they got that voice clip from them, and then they're able to doctor it and things like that of that nature. So yeah, it's pretty scary in that regard. So I do really like your advice about that. If you are suspicious and you are getting something like that, better just, okay, I'm going to call the financial institution and make sure, right? Because it's going to be in your system, right? If there is an issue or something of that nature. So it shouldn't matter really who you talk to because you're in that database anyway. So so thank you for those. Yeah, I think it's something that maybe not too, like I'm aware of it just because in the podcast world, it's one of these editing tools that we've seen get released now where you can actually create audio without actually speaking and make it sound completely like you. And so it's really fascinating technology and can be used for good, but obviously can also help it be really bad for impersonating as well. And so I think, Canadians and just the world in general needs to be very much aware of this.
That's the big problem, right? I talked a lot about how we're leveraging AI and machine learning. Bad guys are doing the same thing as well.
Exactly. Yeah. Never-ending battle, but that's why it's good to have this on our radar. Good to know. Like you said, I appreciate you telling us the best practices as well and what's working well and best ways to protect ourselves. And I'm glad you guys exist. Keep pushing the envelope in terms of security and investing heavily into it so that us, the consumers like myself, can benefit from it. So thank you for that.
Pleasure.
Awesome. And for those of us eager to learn more and help equip ourselves better against these digital threats, where can we find some additional resources or education? I have a link that I've set up as well, referring to a really good page, but maybe you can tell us as well, what are some good go-to resources that you'd like to refer people to?
Absolutely. Look, rbc.com has a lot of great online resources. The one I would specifically call out is there's a link there that says how RBC keeps you safe from fraud. That's one. And a second link that we have is how to protect yourself online. Really important links, has great sets of tips and resources as well. And then look, if you ever are in a branch and you can speak to our advisors or call centers as well, they can absolutely help with guiding. Look, it's our mission purpose to make sure clients feel safe. They're digitally protected as well. So lots of information and we're here to help.
Okay, that's wonderful. Yeah, and the link that I have set up, I mentioned this when I was interviewing your colleague. It's buildwealthcanada.ca/security. That's going to take you to one of the RBC pages you guys put together, which I went through the entire thing. It was really good. It had different categories that you could select for different kind of context. And then it will tell you the best practices in each one. So yeah, really nice that you guys are, again, putting in the resources to create things like this, to raise awareness and to help keep us all safe. So yeah, I feel like it's a win if we all follow these, except for the fraudsters, they're not going to win. But the bank's happy, us consumers are happy when we're not getting hacked. Everyone wins. So thank you for that.
My pleasure. My pleasure, Cornell. It's been a lot of fun. I really enjoyed this.
Thanks for listening to the Build Wealth Canada podcast at www.buildwealthcanada.ca.